going on, everybody? We're here with Live Fire. We're doing a quick news update podcast, electric storms, the dangers of EV fires after hurricanes, tornadoes, and any type of inclement weather. I'm here with our co-host, Bryson Miller, and today we're just going to be going over some of the more recent storms and some of the risks that come from lithium-ion batteries after big natural disaster.
Hi.
Yeah, so with that recent storm, it's pretty crazy. Hurricane Helene, it's like the death toll is over a couple hundred. What are you hearing, like boots on the ground, of how lithium-ion batteries and those electric cars are starting to catch fire over and over again? Like
I was over there for the weekend, so I kind of saw some of it firsthand. Saw a couple of the houses that caught on fire from the batteries, and it's pretty tragic. Not only to have just your house be inundated by a storm surge, but then to also burn down. It's kind of like a double whammy. But as far as statistically speaking, we don't have a lot of things from this storm, but our closest precedent would be back Hurricane Ian back in 2022, and there's about 3,000 electric vehicles that were compromised during that storm. They're saying 3,000 to 5,000, and 36 reported that actually caught on fire. So it's alarming, these fires. It didn't always happen immediately. So people would come back to their homes, they think everything's in the clear, and then 2 or 3 days, a week later, 10 days later, the damaged car, because it's not a priority sitting in the garage, catches on fire, and then they lose their homes. As far as the statistics, among the first 16 EVs, I think that they reported, because these are really the only stats that there are, it was 14 Teslas, 1 Porsche, and 1 Lucid. So you're going to have a lot more a lot more Teslas, because there's more on the road. But that's kind of, there's really no manufacturer that's isolated from the issue.
You think this is a saltwater problem with these EVs catching fire, or you think it would happen just with normal flood waters, with freshwater runaway in canals and stuff like that? Because I know that the saltwater with the lithium-ion battery chemistry caused a recipe for disaster.
Well, saltwater is particularly dangerous for EV batteries because salt conducts electricity. In fact, there's even batteries, sodium-ion batteries, that are that exact chemistry. But it really does increase to the likelihood. We do have a little bit of a variable in that we've seen some freshwater flooding in the areas in California, and it hasn't caused the same frequency of EV fire, but it is definitely still a concern. Batteries are designed so that they can vent, right? Because they get hot, so that hot air has to come out somehow. So when it's fully submerged in water, that's when you see the issue. The seals break down, the vent port's covered, and eventually you're going to have intrusion. So that's when the conductivity, starts to happen.
What about the salinity in the water? Because we're talking about pure saltwater flooding, but there's going to be obviously a mix of fresh and salt water. Mm-hmm. Is any amount of salt risky?
Well, it's yes. Any amount of saltwater intrusion is risky. It's kind of interesting is there's a couple of universities somewhere that are playing with the chemistry of a extinguisher using salt water, because the right amount of salinity in the water will actually stop the thermal runaway, but it's got to be so precise that there's no time whenever you're dealing with a flood situation that's going to be the case.
What are some of the similarities that we've seen to the other storm that was in Florida, I think Hurricane Ian, a couple years ago? Are we seeing the same kind of trends with all these EVs?
It's trending up. It's the EVs aren't getting any safer. You're just getting more and more on the road, so the instances are starting to go up. I know from this storm, even I've heard of a couple instances of scooters or bicycles or something of that nature actually starting the fire. So we're starting to see it branch out into other forms of lithium-ion batteries because they're becoming more prevalent. So, yeah, this issue won't be going away in saltwater-prone areas anytime that there's a flood.
So if you're driving through a flooded area, right, mm-hmm. What would indicate, other than the floorboard being covered, what would indicate some things that water is starting to get into places that it shouldn't be? In
an EV, that's really going to be your best indicator, because think of an EV like a skateboard, right? Like the bottom of a skateboard is like a flat piece of wood. The wheels are out to the side. It's completely sealed up under there. So it's not like your traditional car where you're going to see things coming out. But obviously, once you're on dry pavement, if you see anything dripping from anywhere under that undercarriage, you know that there's been water intrusion inside there. The battery packs are made to be water resistant, but not waterproof.
So how do we track these things? Is there some type of source of truth where we're getting the information from? I know we've compiled some news sources, but is there anybody like FEMA or United States Coast Guard or some type of government agency that's tracking any of this stuff right now? Or is it kind of just...
Yeah, to my knowledge, there's really no database out there that's kind of keeping up with where they are, what's happening. I know after Hurricane Ian, there was a response where they put all these cars out into a field. If it wasn't a flood damaged EV, they put the cars out in the field, like a holding lot, and they had to surround each car. They spaced each car 50 feet apart. So if you calculate that, that's enough space for 30 parked cars. So imagine a parking lot where you can take 30 spaces and there's only one car there. So that's the kind of things that they're reactionary is kind of where we're at this stage. And I think we could probably get into some databases and tracking and things like that, so that at least first responders and people are aware of where these are and be able to respond accordingly. You know, with our blanket system, I think it's a perfect solution to this kind of intermediate problem, because the water recedes, your car's still inside there, no one really knows the danger. You can cover it with the blanket, and then once you have the tow truck or someone else able to remove it from your house, the danger's clear again. But that short amount of time where you're sharing the same roof with that flood damaged car, it's kind of like a recipe for a disaster, pretty much playing Russian roulette. 6%, I believe, was the statistic from Ian of EVs that caught on fire after the storm.
What car type or kind catches the most fire most frequently during this type of stuff? It's usually like Tesla, right?
Yeah, I mean,
there's so many more Teslas.
Yeah, that's it. It's the registration numbers, right? Like if we look at the data of how many Teslas are registered compared to everything else, it's probably like 20-1. I don't even know who second would be. You know, I don't even have a clue. So yeah, that's why you see so many more of theirs having issues, is they just have the market cornered.
All right, I got to jump on this call. And the reignition rate on those EVs was like something like 50%, I think.
Yeah, 50%, 70%. Most all of them caught on fire multiple times until it completely burned out, because then essentially all the fuel is consumed. So
what does that mean for people that have EVs that might have caught fire during Helene, or they're at risk of catching fire? How many times do they burn over again? What is the likelihood of that happening on a normal basis? Does that happen at heightened numbers because of the storm, or does that happen regularly where EVs will catch fire multiple times?
No, I mean, anytime an EV catches on fire, let's say it's in an accident, it's any sort of damage, something completely unrelated to a storm surge or anything like that, it still has a very high likelihood of catching on fire again, just due to the chemistry and the way thermal runaway works. So you can stop the propagation at this cell, but eventually we don't know how compromised it is, and a week later it could trigger the next one to go. So you kind of get a chain reaction until all of those are consumed.
So what happens next? How do first responders respond to these incidents if they don't have a blanket in hand, and how can they get a blanket in hand to help them with the next couple weeks, which is going to be pretty crazy with all the recovery stuff?
Yeah, I think the best thing that you can do is obviously get it outside of the structure, as fast as possible. I know there's not really a database or anything like that. One of the things I'd like to, somehow maybe create is some registry where people they've had a flood damaged EV, they can kind of put it on there. We could disperse a team out where we could cover it with a blanket. FEMA could cover it with a blanket. Someone could at least get it covered up until the extraction point where you can go put it in a field to burn with the rest of them that have been flood damaged. So there's really, I don't know that removing it outside of the structure, there's really no other way to mitigate it.
So what do you do if you can't move your EV out of water? There's a lot of EVs out there that are easily retractable from the floodwaters, but what if someone's stuck in mud or for some reason it's immobile?
I think that's what you're seeing all the way up into North Carolina now, right? It's they can't even, there's no roads left, so you're not calling a tow truck right now to say, hey, come get my EV out of the house or out of the garage that I share a roof with, right? So in my opinion, the best thing you can do is cover it up with one of our blankets. We've done plenty of tests over the last year to show that they can withstand these kind of temperatures. And if you do have an incident, if you are one of those 6% that the EV does catch on fire, at least your house is not going to burn down on top of the other disaster that you have going with flood damage and everything else.
If you own an EV, how easy is it to deploy the blanket if you're not like an expert or a firefighter?
It's very simple. I mean the 20 by 27 size is about the size we would recommend to cover a Tesla, something like that. It's easily deployed by one large man or two smaller people in a not an emergency situation, right? Like you're not in a big hurry. You're deploying this preventatively, so there's not really a need to be in a hurry about it. It's fairly simple. It would essentially be no different than covering your car with a car cover.
So talking about the damages from the storm and cars catching on fire, cars being damaged from the floodwaters. How does somebody safely know that their vehicle's back to normal?
Well, I think you're going to have to, if the floorboard's wet in your car, especially if it's an EV, chances are, 98% of the time, it's going to be a totaled vehicle. So, they're going to need to reach out to their insurance companies. They're going to have to take it to a repair shop. It's all going to have to be assessed. But there's a very low likelihood that a car that has seen that much saltwater intrusion is going to be a salvageable vehicle.
So what's the next best solution then? If there's some damage, but there's not a ton of damage, right? So we're talking about the extreme cases where
with flood damage, it's kind of like all or nothing, right? There's really no in between.
On the blanket side for consumers, let's say I have a Tesla in my house, there's some water damage, maybe it's not totaled or it's not what you're talking about where the whole floorboard is covered. How long do I keep the blanket covered over the vehicle? Do I need to do that for a couple weeks, couple months, or is it just like a
it's kind of like what I'm saying. It's kind of a all or nothing in a flood situation. Like there's not it's either going to be above the floorboard or it's not. So you're essentially going to put the blanket over it until you can get it removed and have it dealt with by an insurance company, a tow truck, a repair shop, whatever it is that you would whoever you would. I would recommend reaching out to your insurance provider. But that would at least tie it over. Because depending on the storm, you don't know when they're going to get the roads open. Obviously, tow trucks, that's not a real priority for them during that time, is to remove a car from a building. So you're going to be varying on the response to that. So this could indefinitely stay over the top of the car. There's no time limit until that part of the operation can be conducted.
So talking about cars, right? Like a lot of people have EVs, but what about like e-bikes and e-scooters? Yeah. How do you know if something like that's compromised?
Anything that's been wet like that is compromised if it's been wet by salt water. Okay. You can, I don't know if you've ever dropped your cell phone in regular water. I have multiple times. It's fine. I've dropped it in the ocean a couple of times and they're done. Even if it says it's, intrinsically safe, whatever. Salt water gets in there and the conductivity just, ruins it. So no matter what that device is powered by, as long as it's a lithium-ion battery, you're going to have that same issue. So I think it's going to be some public awareness of prior to storms, making sure if you have a second story, make sure all of your batteries are up out of, flood's way. Obviously you can't park your EV on the second story, but, take the mitigation risk ahead of time. One thing I did see a lot of when we were in Tampa was a lot of the parking lots for the larger grocery stores, shopping malls, those kind of things, that people had brought their cars across from, Indian Rocks Beach and parked them up there to, prevent them from being flooded out. So not just because they were EVs, they were doing this, of course.
Yeah. So what about the different types of vehicles, right? We're talking about Teslas, Rivians, all those type of EVs. We're talking about e-bikes, e-scooters. Like what other things could be at risk, right? Something that comes to mind is like golf carts, right?
Yeah, golf carts, anything with the lithium-ion battery. So yeah, ranging from golf carts to, your kids like Power Wheels anymore, your lawnmowers, your hedge trimmers, all leaf blowers, all of these, drills, power tools, any of these things, it's not a guarantee they're going to catch on fire if they've been exposed to salt water, but the probability goes up pretty high. And no matter what, the battery is definitely no longer any good.
Does the size of the battery impact the amount of damage that something like this will do? Obviously, logically it makes sense. Like a bigger battery will cause bigger damage, but we've seen some e-scooters tear whole houses down. So
yeah, a lot of it just depends on what it's surrounded by, right? Like how much other flammable materials around it. You can see a scooter burn down a whole house, not just because the battery had so much energy. So yeah, the bigger the battery, the bigger the problem. Think about it like a gas can. The 5 gallons of gas has more energy stored and more explosive force if it were to be lit on fire than 1 gallon. And the same thing rings true with batteries. Also with batteries, it depends on how charged they are. So a battery at zero state of charge has a very, very low probability of ever going into thermal runaway because it doesn't have enough energy there to make the heat required.
Yep. What about charging stations then? Do those pose any risk?
That after they've been flooded themselves? Yeah, I'm not really sure about that. I think that's probably more on the power grid side. So no, it's going to be probably a transformer type thing, something like that. I don't think really the likelihood's going to be there that they're going to catch on fire.
So do you recommend people uncharge their EVs during this time to take away that
if
risk?
Possible, yeah, that's always going to be a good thing. Better yet, just move it to higher ground, so to speak. Find a Walmart parking lot and take an Uber to your house or something along those lines just to be safe. It's a It's a new problem that no one really thought about, right? Nobody's considered that with their gas cars. So as these things evolve, we just have to be proactive and try to educate the consumers as much as possible about the dangers, and also, how products like ours can help to prevent some of the heartache of not only having a flood damaged home, but also one that's burnt to the ground.
What blanket do you think would be most effective for firefighters, FEMA workers, Coast Guard, the U.S. Army, everybody out there?
Yeah, I mean, I think
what would
universal,
be the best sizes?
20 by 27, 20 by 30 are about the most appropriate sizes. 20 by 27 is easily going to cover a Tesla. 20 by 30 gets up to where it'll cover like an F-150 size. We've yet to test it on a Cybertruck, but we should probably do that to make sure the coverage is there. So that's kind of what we would recommend, just as a broad spectrum that kind of protects everyone.